In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use modifiers to aid in building our models. Alright, so taking a look at 14 underscore review, you can see our object is quite complex. We've got a little bit of a twist going on with this object, and it's also bending over in one direction. So looking at this, using box modeling methods might take a little while. Another thing that you'll notice is that the individual strands themselves seem to be very similar, and they're all being affected at the same time. So whenever looking at something like this, you could probably be sure that it's got some sort of modifier being applied to it. Now, with modifiers, there are a lot, and it's a good idea to go in and start to experiment with each individual modifier just to kind of get the capabilities and have that in your brain and be ready to use those just to make your modeling process a little bit easier. Now, for this particular review, we're going to be using some of the more common modifiers just to get you started. So looking at this, if I want to break it down, I know that there are 8 different strands for this. They look to be in a box shape, and they're also very smooth. So that tells me that it's using some sort of turbo smooth or even NURMS to smooth that out. And then the rest is taken care of with some sort of modifier. So to get started with this, let's create one individual strand, and then we're going to copy that to create the other 7. So to get started, let's go into 3ds Max, and let's create a simple box. I'm going to drag this out and up, and I'm going to set my length to 15 and my width to 15, and then my height I'm going to set to 200. Okay, and that should give me a pretty good value for that. Now, I also have my length and width segments set to 4, and then my height segments are set to 12. I'm going to go ahead and bump that up. I'm going to take my height segments to maybe 28 or so, just to make that a little more even. Now, looking at this, this isn't smoothed out very well, so I'm going to convert this to editable poly, and then I'm going to apply a turbo smooth modifier to this. It does a pretty good job. The bottom is a little too smooth, so let me turn on isoline display, and let's bump our iterations up to 2, and then under editable poly, I'm going to add a swift loop across the bottom just to tighten that up. Do the same thing up here at the top. We'll right click to end that. So now that we have our object smoothed out, we need to create the rest of these. So to do this, let's go ahead and select our object, and let's set it to 0, 0, 0. Okay, just to center that up. And then I'm going to move this out in the X. Let's move it out to around 60 on our X direction. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset its pivot point back to 0, because what I want to do is I want to make a clone of this, and I'm going to clone this around to where it makes a complete circle around 0, 0. So let's go to our hierarchy panel, Effect Pivot Only, and then we're going to set it to 0 on the X. Let's turn that off, and now what we can do is we can grab our rotation tool, hold down Shift, and rotate this 45 degrees, and then we can make some copies of this. Now, I want to have the ability to make my adjustments to each one of these individual objects, but I want them to be the same if I make any changes. So I'm going to set it to instance. So if I make one change to one, it will change the others. So setting this to instance, we're going to make 7 more copies. Let's hit OK, and you'll see that that's created a complete circle there. So now what I can do is if I go to my Modify panel, and I need to change the height of one of these, I need to go to Vertex mode, and I could select all of the vertices in one. Okay, notice how it selects all of those, and I can scale these, let's say in my Z direction, and take that up if I want to make those a little bit taller. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bump this up on all of these. Let's select all of those and bump that up to where they're sitting right on the grid. And then I'm going to go to my hierarchy panel, effect pivot only, and let's set all of those to 0. Now, notice here that each individual one's pivot point is being set. I'm happy with my height and everything, so I'm going to go ahead and attach all of these together. Okay, instead of making them individual, let's make them all one piece. So inside of our Modify panel, let's go to Editable Poly, and I'm going to attach these objects. Now notice that they're not attaching because they are instances of one another. So what I need to do is come in and select all of these and hit Make Unique. This is going to make the items unique so they're no longer instances of one another. Notice that it's no longer in bold. And now I can come in and say Attach, and then attach these individual objects. So just a couple of things to think about whenever using instancing. Also, I'm going to affect my pivot, and let's set this back down to 0. There we go. So now I have all of these objects. They're nice and smooth. Everything is looking good up to this point. And now all I need to do is apply those modifiers and get that shape that we saw in our reference image. So with this object selected, let's go to our Modify panel, and let's apply what's called the Twist modifier. So I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to go to Twist, and you'll see that it gives us this box, and it hasn't actually twisted anything yet. It won't twist until we add an angle. So we're going to be again adjusting this angle, and you'll see that that twists our object. Okay, so let's go to about 120 degrees on our twist here. That's going to be a good value for us. That looks nice and neat and gives us plenty of control. Now, with our twist modifier, you can see here that we can adjust the axis in which that is twisting. And Z was going to be the axis that we wanted for ours, but you may have to switch that at some point in your own projects. Now, you also have the ability to limit this effect to certain parts of the object. So if I hit a limit effect, you'll notice that it resets everything and is no longer applying that effect. Now, if I adjust my upper limit, you'll notice that it starts to twist again. And now it's twisting from the bottom and leaving everything else perfectly straight. So I can set up my twist here, and that's looking good. And I'm going to set this up to, looks like the value that I need is going to be around 300. Now I could also set a lower limit amount, and if I pull that down, anything that's below that will not be affected. So let's go ahead and set this back to 0. Take our upper limit or lower limit up to, let's take that all the way back up to like 300, and then let's draw that down. And notice how that's only affecting what's at the top. So we're creating a range in which this is going to be affected. Okay, so we can set this to 300, make sure it's right at the top, and then we'll set our lower limit up or down. Okay, now I don't necessarily need that, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Now, the great thing about modifiers is that you're not limited to just one modifier. You can apply multiples. Okay, and you could even apply multiples of the same modifier. So if I wanted to twist this altogether, okay, and adjust that and add even more twist, or just twist it in a different direction, I could do so. Okay, so we're creating something that's totally wacky there, but kind of a neat little effect. And again, we still have the ability to use our limit effect and make those adjustments. Okay, so that's always available to you. Now, in this case, I'm going to delete that modifier. Let's use a different one. Let's use what's called bend. Now, bend has the same type of controls as twist. So if I adjust my angle, you'll notice that that begins to bend in a specific direction. So let's set that to 90, because that's exactly what it looks like in our reference image. Now, one thing that we'll notice is we've got a little bit of a taper here. So it's really wide at the bottom and appears to be wide in the middle, and then it comes down and tapers at the very end. So let's take a look at the rest of our parameters. In this bend, we have this direction. Okay, and that's just adjusting the overall direction. So where are we getting that taper from? Well, if we go into our modifiers, we actually have another modifier called taper. And if we adjust this, that begins to taper our object. But notice it's not tapering along the overall surface like it was in our reference image. Well, one thing to remember about modifiers is that they might have to be applied in a specific order. So we may have to have our twist first, and then our taper, and then let our bend do its work. So let's drag our taper down below our bend. Notice that that's giving us the effect. Let's turn off our bend for a moment, so that way we can just see exactly what we have here. So here we have our taper. There it's getting very skinny at the top. That's looking great. And then we have this curve. If I adjust that curve, notice how that's popping outward. I can take my amount down on my taper, pull that up a little bit higher to 0, and look what that's giving us here. Now if I turn on my bend, notice here that it's tapered outward and then bent over. We just recreated that shape that we see in our reference image. So those are some things to think about with your modifiers. It matters on your segments. So if you don't have enough segments on your geometry to allow these modifiers to work, it's not going to give you the result. And speaking of which, we may have to bump up our iterations one more time on that just to make sure that this is nice and smooth. If you don't have enough segments, if the modifier is in the wrong order, you can use limit effects, make sure that your axis is set. Modifiers can be a really great way for modeling your objects. So now that we have this built out and we know how we can begin to use modifiers and we know the basis of those, let's go into our next lesson where we're going to talk about the exercise for modifiers.